The first time our eyes met wasn't during a grand moment, it was mid-rep, her breath steady, my hand adjusting her form. But in that split second, something shifted, and neither of us trained the same way again. I still remember the first day she walked into the gym. It wasn't one of those cinematic entrances where everything slows down and heads turn. No, it was quiet. She moved through the door with a kind of understated confidence, the kind that doesn't beg for attention but naturally commands it. She was in her late 30s, dressed simply, black leggings, a fitted gray top, hair pulled back into a neat ponytail. But there was something in the way she carried herself, poised, deliberate, like she knew exactly why she was there. I glanced at my clipboard. She was my new client for the evening. Her name was Lena. 38. Recently returned after a long break from working out. She gave me a polite smile when I introduced myself. Firm handshake. Direct eye contact. Not shy, not overly chatty. Just, composed. We started with the basics, posture checks, warm-up stretches, light weights. I explained the proper stance for each movement, watching how she adjusted, how quickly she caught on. She didn't complain, didn't make excuses. She listened. And there was something quietly magnetic about that kind of focus. About halfway through, I noticed her shoulders tense slightly during a set of overhead presses. I stepped closer, gently placing my hand on the side of her arm to guide her alignment. The moment my fingertips touched her skin through the fabric, time seemed to narrow. She froze, not in discomfort, but in awareness. Her head turned slightly, eyes meeting mine. Just for a second. But in that second, there was a spark neither of us planned for. I quickly refocused, adjusting her form with professional precision. There, I said softly, keep your elbows just under the wrists. My voice was steady, but inside, something shifted. She finished the set flawlessly, lowered the weights with a slow, controlled breath, and gave a small nod, the kind people give when they're quietly proud of themselves. Better, she said, her voice low and sure. I nodded back, maybe holding her gaze a beat too long before looking away. The rest of the session went smoothly, but I'd be lying if I said that moment didn't linger. Every time I circled around to correct her posture, every time our hands brushed when passing a towel or water bottle, that same charged stillness crept in. She wasn't flirting. Neither was I. But something unspoken had found its way between the reps and the cues. When the session ended, she thanked me with that same composed smile. See you next time, she said, and walked out with steady strides. I stood there for a moment longer than I should have, staring at the door after it closed. I've trained hundreds of clients. I've adjusted countless postures, corrected endless stances. But that first touch, the way her gaze locked with mine, the faint warmth that lingered on my fingertips, it wasn't something I could file away like another day at work. Something began that night, quietly, like the first spark before a slow, inevitable fire. It was a Friday evening when everything shifted just a little deeper. The gym was unusually quiet. The usual crowd of late workers had cleared out early, and the faint hum of the overhead lights filled the stillness. Lena had pushed herself harder than usual that day, heavier weights, longer sets. There was something focused, almost restless, in her movements. When we wrapped up, I expected her to leave as she usually did. But she didn't. She sat on the edge of the bench, elbows resting on her knees, hands clasped loosely, her gaze fixed somewhere on the floor. Her water bottle was untouched. I was behind the counter, finishing up the register and locking away the equipment when I noticed she hadn't moved. I walked over, wiping my hands on a towel. "Hey," I said softly, "you okay?" She looked up at me, and for the first time, her usual composed expression faltered. "Yeah," she said after a pause, "just needed a minute." Her voice was calm, but there was a layer beneath it, something quiet and raw. I didn't push. I just sat down on the bench beside her, leaving a respectful space between us. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that invites honesty. She broke it first. "You ever have those moments," she said slowly, "where you realize you've spent so much time taking care of everything, except yourself?" I nodded. "Yeah. More often than I'd admit." She exhaled a small laugh, not joyful, more like relief that someone understood. Then, as if something in her had decided it was time, she started talking. Not about workouts, or routines, or surface-level things. She told me about why she started training again, how after her marriage ended quietly 2 years ago, she realized she'd lost a part of herself along the way. How fitness wasn't just about strength for her, but about reclaiming something she'd let fade. Her voice didn't crack. She didn't dramatize it. She spoke like someone who had learned to live with her story, even if it still stung. I listened, not as her trainer, but as a man sitting next to a woman who'd stopped pretending for a moment. When she finished, there was a pause, a soft, meaningful one. I turned slightly toward her and placed my hand lightly on her forearm. It wasn't calculated. It just happened. Her skin was warm, her pulse steady beneath my fingers. "You're stronger than you think," I said quietly. She didn't pull away. Instead, her eyes met mine, not guarded, not teasing, but open. Vulnerable in a way I hadn't seen before. And in that silent exchange, something subtle shifted between us. She stood after a moment, rolling her shoulders like someone shaking off a weight. "Thanks," she said softly. Not the casual kind of thanks, the kind that lands deep. As she walked toward the door, she glanced back once, her expression unreadable but lingering. I stood there long after she left, the echo of that conversation settling in my chest like a quiet storm. That night wasn't about glances or touches. It was about trust. And trust, I realized, is where the real spark begins. The following week, Lena arrived with a different kind of energy. Not loud, not manic, focused. Determined. Her ponytail was tighter than usual, her warm-up shorter. She greeted me with a brief smile, the kind that didn't need words. From the way she adjusted her gloves and set down her bottle, I could tell she had something to prove, maybe to herself, maybe to me. We started with her usual routine, but she was pushing herself harder with every set. No skipped reps, no second-guessing. Just quiet intensity. When she moved to weighted lunges, I stood behind her, watching her form carefully. Sweat rolled down the side of her temple, glinting in the gym's warm overhead light. Her breathing was heavy but steady. "2 more," I said, counting her final reps. She exhaled sharply, muscles trembling with effort. And then, between breaths, barely above a whisper, came the words, "Push me, just a little further." It wasn't flirtatious. It wasn't casual. It was layered, charged. The way her voice dipped into that low, breathy tone sent a quiet jolt through me. She looked at me over her shoulder, not seeking permission, but connection. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "All right. 1 more set. We'll do it together." She nodded. I placed my hands lightly at her waist to steady her form as she stepped into the next lunge. The heat from her body radiated through the fabric beneath my fingers. My breath brushed against the side of her neck as I counted softly in her ear. For a moment, the clanging of weights, the chatter from the treadmills, everything else, faded. It was just her breathing, my voice, and the rhythm between us. She pushed through the set, face flushed, determination etched into every movement. When she finished the last rep, she stayed there for a second, head bowed, chest rising and falling, before standing upright slowly. Our faces ended up closer than either of us planned. Close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in her eyes, close enough that the air between us felt charged, humming with something unspoken. Neither of us moved. Not immediately. I could feel the warmth of her breath against my cheek. Her hands, still gripping the dumbbells, relaxed just slightly as if surrendering to the moment. Then she let out a soft laugh, breaking the intensity just enough. "You don't go easy, do you?" I smiled, stepping back to give her space. "You told me to push you." She tilted her head, that playful spark returning. "Yeah. I did." We continued the rest of the session with the same quiet fire between us. The touches remained professional, but every adjustment, every shared glance carried that lingering undertone from earlier. When she left that evening, she didn't say goodbye right away. She stood by the door, water bottle in hand, watching me for a moment like she wanted to say something but decided against it. Then, with a soft smile, she simply said, "See you Friday." As the door closed behind her, I found myself standing in the middle of the gym, replaying that whisper in my head. "Push me, just a little further." It echoed deeper than it should have. Because somewhere between the sets and seconds, we'd crossed an invisible line, quietly, undeniably. It happened by coincidence, or maybe something a little less random. It was a Sunday evening, the kind where the sky held on to the last traces of light like it wasn't ready to let go. I'd gone for a walk through the park near my apartment, a habit I'd picked up to clear my head after long weeks. The air was cool, carrying that early hint of autumn. And then, I saw her. Lena was sitting on a wooden bench beneath a wide old oak, her legs crossed, a light sweater draped over her workout leggings, hair loosely tied. She was reading, completely absorbed, a faint smile curving her lips at some line on the page. She looked different outside the gym, softer, lighter. Not the focused, intense woman pushing through reps, she looked, at ease. I hesitated for a moment before walking over. "I didn't think I'd see you off duty," I said, keeping my tone casual. She looked up, surprised for only a second before her face broke into a warm smile. "You caught me," she said, closing the book gently. "This is my favorite spot. It's quiet." I nodded, sitting down beside her but leaving a respectful distance. The world around us felt slower. Kids were playing in the distance, a couple jogged past, but here under the tree, it was just the two of us. Without the clanging of weights and structured routines, our conversation flowed differently. She told me about the books she loved, stories of people rebuilding themselves, finding unexpected connections. I told her about the late-night runs that helped me think. She laughed more freely here, the sound softer than in the gym but warmer somehow. At one point, a cool breeze swept through, and she instinctively pulled her sweater tighter around herself. Without thinking, I slipped off my jacket and held it out to her. "Here." She gave me a playful look. "You'll be cold." "I'll survive," I said. She accepted it, slipping it over her shoulders. My jacket looked big on her, the sleeves covering part of her hands, and for some reason, that sight lodged itself somewhere deep in my chest. She inhaled softly as the fabric settled around her. "Smells like coffee," she murmured with a faint smile. We started walking after that, following the path lined with dim park lights. Our shoulders brushed occasionally, not deliberately at first, but neither of us stepped away. With each light touch, the air between us grew warmer, more intimate in its quiet way. She glanced sideways at me as we walked. "You're different out here," she said. "So are you," I replied. She laughed softly. "Guess the gym doesn't get the full version of either of us." By the time we reached the end of the path, night had fully settled in. We paused under a street lamp, a soft amber glow falling between us. There was no awkwardness. Just a stillness that said everything neither of us voiced. She handed me my jacket back slowly, fingers brushing mine as she did. "Thanks," she said quietly. "Anytime," I replied. As she walked away, her figure fading into the warm night, I realized this was the first time I'd seen her without the walls, no weights, no schedules. Just Lena. And it made everything between us feel both simpler, and far more complicated. It was late on a Thursday night when the truth finally broke through the spaces between us. The gym was almost empty, just the hum of the air conditioner and the rhythmic sound of Lena finishing her last set on the rowing machine. Her hair was damp, loose strands framing her flushed face. There was something quieter about her tonight. Focused, but in a different way. When she finished, she stayed seated, catching her breath, staring at the floor like she was searching for the right word she hadn't decided to speak yet. I was leaning against the wall, arms folded, watching her with the kind of attention I couldn't disguise anymore. "Good work today," I said, trying to keep my tone even. She gave me a small nod, still looking down. "Thanks." Normally, that would have been it, a quick goodbye, maybe a joke, and she'd head out. But she didn't move. The silence stretched out long enough that I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "Lena, what's on your mind?" She lifted her gaze slowly. There was no teasing in her eyes this time. Just a soft, honest vulnerability. "You ever feel like, something's been building for a while, and you keep pretending it's not, because it's easier that way?" Her words landed somewhere deep in my chest. My instinct was to deflect, keep things simple. But something in her expression wouldn't let me hide. "Yeah," I said quietly. "I know exactly what that feels like." She gave a small, almost nervous laugh. "I didn't plan on saying anything tonight. But every time I try to ignore it, it just gets louder." She paused, her hands resting loosely on her knees, fingers fidgeting with the hem of her top. "I think about you, outside of here. More than I should." My breath caught. For a second, everything around us, the machines, the lights, the walls, disappeared. It was just her words hanging in the air between us. I took a step closer, slowly, deliberately. "You're not the only one," I said. She let out a shaky breath, like she'd been holding it for weeks. She stood, and suddenly we were closer than we'd ever been. Close enough that I could see the faint freckles across her nose, the tired softness around her eyes, the flicker of relief that came with being understood. I reached out, not to pull her in, but to offer something real. My fingers brushed against hers, gently, as if asking permission. She didn't pull away. Instead, her hand slid into mine, fingers lacing together slowly, deliberately, like it was the most natural thing in the world. The air between us shifted. There were no grand declarations, no cinematic background music. Just the quiet hum of a gym after hours and two people finally letting the truth settle in. She squeezed my hand lightly, her thumb tracing a small circle against my skin. "I was scared you'd say I imagined it," she whispered. I shook my head, a small smile breaking through. "No, Lena. You didn't imagine it." In that moment, something unspoken became real. Not rushed. Not loud. Just honest, the kind of honesty that leaves the world changed afterward. Weeks passed, but everything between us felt different now, warmer, deeper, steadier. Lena still came to the gym at the same time, still wore that quiet focus like a second skin. But now, there was something softer layered beneath it. A shared glance when she walked in. A smile that lingered a little longer than before. A quiet understanding that neither of us had to name anymore. We didn't make a spectacle of it. There were no sudden changes in our routine, no overplayed gestures. It was in the small things. She'd linger after sessions, leaning against the wall while I closed up, tossing light jokes that made even the empty gym feel alive. I'd walk her to her car most nights, hands brushing as we walked, the silence between us comfortable, almost protective. One evening after a late session, the gym lights were dimmed low, and the world outside had that muted hum only late nights bring. She finished her workout, and I handed her a towel. She wrapped it around her shoulders, cheeks flushed, hair sticking slightly to her skin. I stepped closer without even thinking about it anymore, gently adjusting the towel so it rested snugly around her. "Still pushing yourself," I said softly. She smiled, that quiet, knowing smile of hers. "Someone told me I'm stronger than I think." The way she said it, half teasing, half sincere, hit somewhere deep. My hand stayed on the edge of the towel a moment longer than it needed to. She didn't move away. Instead, she took a small step closer, closing the space between us until I could feel the warmth radiating off her skin. Without a word, I slid my arms lightly around her, careful and slow, giving her space to pull away if she wanted. She didn't. Her arms came around my waist in response, firm but gentle, her cheek resting against my chest. I felt her heartbeat, steady and calm, matching mine in a rhythm that didn't need explanation. The hug wasn't rushed. It lingered, soft, grounding, real. It wasn't about attraction in that moment. It was about everything we'd built quietly over weeks, trust, understanding, something that grew not from sparks alone but from shared silences, whispered words, and steady hands. When she finally looked up, there was no hesitation in her gaze. "This," she said quietly, searching my face, "I didn't expect it." "Neither did I admitted. "But I'm not running from it." She nodded, her expression softening. "Good. Because I don't want to, either." We didn't rush into anything beyond that. No labels. No forced plans. Just two people, standing in the quiet of an almost empty gym, knowing that something real had taken root. Outside, the night air was cool as I walked her to her car. She slipped her hand into mine naturally, like we'd done it 100 times before. No glances over shoulders. No pretending. Just us. As she drove away, I stood in the parking lot for a moment, breathing in the silence. What started as reps, adjustments, and unspoken glances had become something deeper, something built in the in-between spaces. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like the beginning of something real.